Hello guys, and welcome back to my video. So in this video we are going to be getting these categories from our server, right, that we created using Node.js, Express and MongoDB, right? So if you have not watched this playlist where we created our backend using Express, Node.js and MongoDB, just make sure you go through these videos and get an insight how to build a backend using Express.js and MongoDB and how to deploy it on AWS, right? So once you have finished with this tutorial or with this playlist, now you can come back to building this job board application using Flutter. This is merely a continuation, right? So without wasting much of the time, let's dive deep into our mobile application, right? So now what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to go to our job board application, right? And then we have the vacancies, right? And then we also have categories, right? So let me just create a new tab here. Then I'm going to paste it and then I'm going to change it to categories. So as you can see, we'll get the categories that we have, right? You can see we have the category ID here. We have the image and also have the category title. Okay. So now let's get back to the Visual Studio and let's start putting in the work, right? So basically what we are going to do, right, inside our features folder, let's create a folder called categories. And then inside categories, let's create subfolders, right? First folder will be repository. And then we also have the controller folder, right? And then we also have the models folder right there, right? And then we also have the screen folder. And then we also have the widgets folder, right? We also have the widgets folder, right? So now that we are done with this, let's start building our mobile application, right? So the first thing that we need to do inside our categories, let's create a category repository, right? Okay, so the first thing that we need is we need an HTTP client for us to make like HTTP request, right? And then let's create a category repository constructor, right? And then let's set it to our let's set our client variable, right, to the one in our constructor, right? So now that we are done with this, right, so let's create a future method for getting our categories, right? Okay, so now what we can do here, let's import the either, right? Let's import the app failure and then also let's import fp.package, right? And then as you can see, also need the category model that we are going to create very soon using Frisk package, right? All right, so as you can see now, we need the category model, right? So what are we going to do? So let's go inside our models folder, and then let's create category model dot that. Okay, so basically what I'm just going to do is I'm going to go inside our user model, and then I'm just going to copy this. I'm just going to copy our user model, and then inside our category model, I'm just going to paste it, right? And then I'm just going to change this, make sure this part file matches your file that you created, the category underscore model. All right. So a category underscore model, right? And then let's change this from user model to category model. And then let's change also this from user model to category model. And then let's also change this to category model also. And then let's change this from user extension to category extension, right? Like this. And then let's change it to category model. Okay. So if I go back to our Postman, right? Let's go back to our Postman. As you can see right here, we only have the title, image, and then category ID, right? So let's go inside our model, and then let's get rid of these other fields right here, right? So let's just get rid of these other fields. So we have the title, and then we also have, if we go back to Postman, we have image and then category ID. So we have image, and then category ID. Then we have the category ID, right? So these are the fields that we have here, right? And then as you can see here, we also have this method for converting like a full image path. We're changing the full image path into, as you can see from our Postman, right? We are not getting these images. We are not getting these images with an HTTP, right? We don't have like a URL redirecting us to this image, right? As you can see, it starts with uploads, categories, and then the image name, right? So if we go to our, let's go to our config folder, right? Let's go back inside our config folder, right? So as you can see, if we go, let's go inside our, as you can see, this is the full image path right here, full image URL. So this will redirect us to our URL, right? And then it uses HTTP, right? Okay, so now that we are done, let's make sure that we generate the classes, right? The first classes, right? So to generate those classes, we use that run build run command, right? So let's generate those the first files, right? As you can see now, we now have the category model.freezed and the category model.g, right? All right, so now there is one thing that we also need to take care of, because we are going to be retrieving a list of categories, right? So we need to create this method. So we need to create this method that is going to just retrieve a list of categories from our server, right? As you can see right here, this model represents one category, right? So this model, as you can see, this model only represents this one category. But as you can see, we have an array. That means we have a list of categories, right? So this method is simply going to allow us to return what? The list of categories from our JSON, right? So now that we're done, let's go back to our repository, right? And then let's just import the category, the job categories right there, right? And then the first thing that we need, we need the request headers, right? And then we just need to provide the accept, and then application / JSON. Right, so simply here is just telling our server to accept any request that is application.json, that is in the format of a JSON format, right? So now we need to define our URL. So our URL is going to be equal to URI.http, right? And then the authority is going to be appconfig.base URL, and then appconfig dot categories, right? Dot job categories URL, like this, right? And then we need a response. So to get a response, what we are simply going to do is we are simply going to await our client, and then we use the get method, right? For the get method, we need to provide the URL, which is this one, which is our URL. And then we need to provide also the headers, which are going to be our request headers right there, right? And then we also need to get the data from our response, which we are going to just decode from our response, right? And then we decode it from the response.body. And then what we simply need to do now is to use the try catch block, so that we can catch any errors that might arise when a mistake occurs, or if there is. So the first thing that we need to do is to make sure we check that the our status code is 200. So if our status code is 200, that means we got a successful response from our server, right? We are simply going to return right, and then we just pass in the job categories from JSON method, and then we just pass in the data, right? So if you still remember, for error handling, we are using either, right, which is a functional programming library that has like two sets. We have the left and then the right. We are going to represent errors with the left. That's why we put our failure here. And then we are going to represent successful responses with the right. For example, if we get a successful response, we are going to simply return a list of categories. If we get a failure, we are simply going to display that failure text, right? All right, so now that we are done, else what we simply need to do is we simply, if there is an error, we are simply going to return left and then up failure. And then we display a message, and then the message is going to come from our data, then message, right? And then we are simply going to catch any errors. And then we are simply going to return also left, right? And then we'll change this to e.message, e.toString, right? e.toString, right? So that's basically it for our category repository for retrieving categories from our backend. Now what we need is we need to create a provider, right? So let's create a final category repository provider. Which is equal to our provider. And then you text in the reference, and then you simply return the category repository, right? And then the client, we are simply going to inject from our HTTP provider, right? So let's import our HTTP. Let's just import HTTP provider here. Let's import it, and then let's import the HTTP provider, right? Oh, sorry, so I made a mistake. It's supposed to be reference.watch HTTP provider, right? Because we're supposed to watch the HTTP provider right there. Okay, so now we are done with our category repository. Now it's time to move on to our category controller, right? Okay, so now let's move on to our category controller, right? So let's create a file. Let's name it category controller. Do that, right? So let's create a class called category controller. So this class is going to extend it's going to extend the async notify class, right? Going to extend the async notify class, which is going to be of type async value. And then the async value, we are simply going to return void, right? And then we need to create a variable for our category repository, right? And then we need to create an override build function, right? And then let's create our build function, which is going to be of async value, type void build, right? And then what we're simply going to do is we are simply going to initialize our category repository, right? We're going to set it to category repository provider, right? And then we are simply going to return async value, your data, right? And then it's going to be of type null, right? And then after this, what we're simply going to do is we're going to return a future type list category model. And then we're simply going to get your categories, right? It's going to be an async function, right? And then we need to make sure we create variable for our response, which is going to be, we are going to await category repository.get job categories, right? And then we are simply going to use a switch statement, right? On our response. And then we are simply going to make sure that the left value is simply going to throw an error, right? Or what we can simply do is we want to just show a snake bar, and then the context, and then the message is going to be l.message, right, for a snake bar. And then for the right, and then the final error, we are simply going to simply display R right there, right? So let's check. We might be getting an error. Saying a value of void can be returned. So why are we getting this error? Let me check. Okay, so instead of, let's just throw an error. Okay. All right, so we are done with our getting job categories, right, inside our controller. Now what we simply need to do is let's create a categories controller provider, which is going to be an async notifier provider. And then it's going to be of type job controller, and the category controller, and then async value type void. And then what's simply going to return is going to return the category controller dot new, right? Okay, so now that we are done, now let's move on to our user interface, right? So inside our widgets, what we are simply going to do is we are going to create a category we are going to create a category widget, right? That. So it's going to be a stateless widget. So category widget, right? And then let's make sure that it's a consumer widget. And then let's make sure that we inject the widget reference and then reference right there, right? So let's import Flutter report, right? So let's just make sure that we import Flutter report, right? And then what we're simply going to do is let's create categories, right? Which is equal to reference.watch, and then we are going to watch. So I think if we go back inside our controller, we forgot one thing, right? So we forgot to create a feature provider for getting our job categories, right? So let's create it. So it's going to be a feature provider, and then type list category model, right? Then it's going to take in a reference. And then what we're simply going to do is find our categories. This goes to reference.watch, and then categories controller provider dot notify, right? And then we are simply going to return the category controller categories dot get categories, right? So now that we're done, now let's go to our category widget here, and then we are going to go simply watch the get categories provider, right? And then now what we can simply do here is we can simply return categories dot when, and then when we get our data, we're simply going to get our data and then we return it. And then if there is an error, we need to simply return a widget that displays that error. So as you can remember, when we started, we created the error text widget, right? And then just error.toString. And then if our data is still loading from our API, what we simply need to do is we simply need to return a circular progress indicator. As you can still remember, we created this loader class with our circular progress indicator, right? So now let's go inside our data function, and then what we simply need to do is let's return a sized box. So in size box, let's give it a height of 120, and then the child, right? Let's give it a child, and then the child is going to be a list view dot builder, right? List view dot builder, and then the item builder is going to take in a context, and then after this context is simply it's going to take in a context, right? and taking a context and then index, right? It's going to take in a context and then index, right? And then the other thing is we need to use shrink wrap so that make sure that it's true, so that our widget, when our widget, if we put it like in a size box, it's able to shrink, right? And then scroll direction, we want it to be axis dot horizontal, right? So we want to scroll along the horizontal axis. And then the other thing that we need is the item count, which is going to be equal to data dot length, right? So the item count is going to be equal to data dot length, right? So inside our item builder class, what we simply now need to do is so inside our list view, we're going to simply return a column widget. So let's return a column widget, and then let's make sure that the main axis alignment is main axis alignment dot start, right? And then children, and then we must simply return a circle avatar, right? And then background color, we set it to color dot black, right? Let's set it to colors dot black, and then let's give it a radius of 40, right? So let's make sure give it a radius of 40, and then the child is going to be image.network, right? Then let's set it to categories dot full image path. So let's make sure that we set it to data index, right? Data index dot full image path, right? And then make sure that the height is 40 and then the width is 40. So let's make sure that the height is 40 and then the width is also 40. The width is also 40, right? And then now let's work on and then let's input the text, and then make sure that set it to data index dot title, right? Dot toString, and then styled, and then let's set the text type, right, to a font size of 12. And then the font weight is going to be font weight. Let's set the font weight to font weight W500, right? So now we are done with setting our padding. Let's make sure that we just wrap this column widget with a padding, because we don't want our items in our list view to be close to each other, right? So now that we're done with this, let's move into our home screen, right? Inside our home screen, and then after our container, we are simply going to like the categories widget after our container, right? So now let's reload our application, and then let's check, right? So simulator. So somehow we are not getting we are not getting the images. So it's saying image provider, it's saying that we're not getting these images, right? So let's go back inside our category model, right? And then so let's go back here. So we need to change this to full image path, right? We need to change this to let's use this, because as you can see here, we're only getting this URL, but it's not redirecting us to our full image path. As you can see, right, this is the path for our image, right? So what we'll simply do is, let's go back to our category model, and then simply use app config full image URL, right? Full image URL, and then / and then we also have to annotate it with the image right here, right? So now if we reload, let's reload our application. Now let's reload our application. As you can see, now we are getting these categories right there. Right now we are getting these categories right there. So now we are finally making progress on our home screen. So in the next video, we are simply going to be getting the job vacancies from our server, right? So thanks for watching, guys. Cheers.